Marlon Brando spent his final years trying to escape a truth that had been eating him alive since childhood, a truth he never dared to speak publicly while the world worshipped him as a god. Behind the myth of the most beautiful man of the century, behind the rebellion, behind the genius who reinvented acting, Brando carried a wound so deep that it shaped every decision, every performance, and every self-destructive spiral of his life. And before he died, he finally admitted it. The secret was simple, brutal, and undeniable, everything that made Marlon Brando extraordinary. The rage, the brilliance, the emotional intensity that electrified the screen came from a place of devastation he never escaped. His childhood, marked by a violent father and an alcoholic mother he had to drag home from bars, left him with a sense of abandonment so profound that he spent the rest of his life fighting every form of authority, sabotaging every structure that tried to contain him, and destroying almost everything he loved. He could master a character in seconds, but he could never master himself. The world saw the rebel who humiliated studios, the prodigy who redefined cinema, the man who refused the Oscar in front of millions. Brando saw something else. He saw the family curse that broke him, a son who killed, a daughter who never healed, a legacy stained by tragedies he felt responsible for. He saw a man who kept running from his own reflection until his body collapsed under the weight of his memories. This is not the story of Hollywood's greatest actor. This is the story of the secret he tried to bury, the truth he could only face when there was no one left to perform for. Long before Hollywood understood what was happening to it, Marlon Brando had already begun dismantling the old world of acting from the inside. He appeared at a time when the industry was still dominated by theatrical diction, rigid posture, and performances designed more for the stage than for the camera. Actors projected, enunciated, and followed scripts as if they were commandments. Emotion was performed, not lived. But Brando walked in like a force of nature, and suddenly nothing felt the same. He didn't just act differently, he made everyone else look outdated. To understand the magnitude of his impact, you have to imagine what it felt like to watch him in the 1950s. Audiences were used to polished dialogue and clean emotional lines, but Brando mumbled, whispered, slurred, and paused in ways no one had seen before. He didn't deliver emotions. He allowed them to spill, unfold, and contradict each other. When he looked away from a camera, it wasn't blocking. It was vulnerability. When he raised his voice, it wasn't written into the script. It was an eruption. Every gesture, every twitch, every breath felt like it came from a volcano hidden just beneath the surface. And suddenly, classic Hollywood seemed artificial next to him. His work in A Streetcar Named Desire shook the industry at its core. Here was a man who didn't play Stanley Kowalski. He became him. Sweaty, violent, sensual, unpredictable, dangerously alive. Critics were confused. Actors were terrified. Directors didn't know if they could control him. But the audience couldn't look away. For the first time, a performance felt like a living organism. Then came On the Waterfront, and the entire world understood they were witnessing something historic. The famous taxi scene, the soft, trembling line, "I could have been a contender," wasn't delivered as written. Brando re-engineered the moment, turning a simple piece of dialogue into one of the most emotionally devastating confessions ever filmed. The way his voice cracked, the way he avoided eye contact, the way he swallowed the weakness he didn't want to show, it all felt painfully human. People didn't feel like they were watching a movie. They felt like they were eavesdropping on a confession someone was never meant to hear. Actors from the next generation worshipped him with a kind of reverence usually reserved for prophets. Al Pacino said Brando wasn't an actor. He was the truth. Jack Nicholson admitted that seeing Brando changed the way he understood cinema. Robert De Niro watched on the waterfront almost religiously, studying the way Brando carried silence as if it were dialogue. Method acting had existed before Brando, but he made it dangerous, seductive, and undeniable. He didn't teach acting, he infected it. But his influence reached far beyond performances. Studios were forced to loosen their grip on creative control because Brando refused to be a puppet. Directors learned they could no longer mold a character entirely on their own. They had to negotiate with the emotional storms Brando brought with him. And audiences, once satisfied with polished heroes and clear-cut emotions, began to crave complexity, contradiction, rawness, the very things Brando embodied. When The Godfather arrived decades later, the transformation was complete. Brando, now older and heavier, shocked the studio by reinventing Don Corleone using nothing but instinct, stuffing tissues into his cheeks, lowering his voice into a haunted whisper, and moving with the regal slowness of a man who carried death in his pocket. It was the performance of a lifetime, and it cemented his legacy not just as a great actor, but as the man who rewrote the language of cinema. Marlon Brando didn't change acting. He rebuilt it from the ashes of what came before, and the industry never recovered. Before the world knew him as the godfather of acting, it knew him as something even more disarming, the most devastatingly beautiful man Hollywood had ever seen. Brando in his youth didn't simply walk into a room, he detonated inside it. His presence carried the kind of physical magnetism that made people lose their breath before they understood why. The square jaw, the soft yet powerful musculature, the animalistic grace, the impossible cheekbones, the half-smile that felt both seductive and threatening, and above all, the eyes, wild, restless, unreadable, like they belonged to someone who could love you or ruin you in the same moment. Journalists, photographers, and co-stars struggled to describe him because no vocabulary felt big enough. Eventually, Hollywood settled on calling him the most beautiful man of the century, not as flattery, but as a statement of fact. Yet that beauty came with an energy that didn't feel peaceful or safe. Brando's attractiveness wasn't gentle or polished. It was dangerous, volatile, magnetic, in a way that made people feel both drawn in and slightly afraid, as if they were approaching a storm they couldn't predict. Even when he sat still, something inside him seemed to coil and uncoil like a trapped animal. Directors noticed it immediately. He never looked fully comfortable in his own skin, as if beauty were a burden he didn't ask for. And the truth is, he didn't want it. He never liked being adored for his looks because he knew his beauty was just camouflage over a soul that had been fractured long before Hollywood ever put him on a poster. Everything about Brando's adulthood, the rebellion, the volatility, the refusal to conform, was rooted in a childhood that left him permanently cracked. His father, a man hardened by rage and alcohol, belittled him relentlessly, convinced him he would never amount to anything, and struck at the very core of his identity long before Brando ever knew who he wanted to become. His mother, whom he adored with a desperate, childlike devotion, was consumed by addiction, drifting from bar to bar until Brando would search for her, lift her from the floor, and carry her home like a child carrying an injured bird. These images never left him. They sat behind his eyes for decades, shaping the way he walked, the way he loved, the way he trusted, and the way he destroyed. This was the paradox that made Brando both irresistible and unreachable. People fell for the beauty, the charisma, the seductive darkness. But beneath it all was a man convinced he was unworthy of stability or affection. Every compliment reminded him of the father who mocked him. Every love reminded him of the mother he couldn't save. Every camera pointed at him reminded him of a world he didn't trust. And so, even at the height of his glory, when magazines declared him the very definition of masculine perfection, Brando was already at war with himself, fighting a phantom he could never overpower. His beauty may have made him a star, but his wounds made him unforgettable. The camera didn't just love him for his face, it loved him for the turbulence behind it, the sense that something broken and dangerous was always flickering beneath the surface. Brando didn't captivate audiences because he was perfect. He captivated them because his perfection looked like it was about to shatter at any moment. And that fragility, wrapped in volcanic power, became the essence of his legend. By the time Marlon Brando became a household name, Hollywood had already realized something unsettling. They could celebrate him, market him, promote him, and rely on his brilliance, but they would never be able to control him. Brando did not fit into the neat machinery of the studio system, a system built on predictability, obedience, and carefully maintained illusions. He was the opposite of all that, unpredictable, uncooperative, defiantly honest, and willing to explode any expectation placed upon him. The moment he sensed authority tightening around him, he ripped himself free, no matter how much it cost his reputation or career. For Brando, rebellion wasn't a phase. It was the language he spoke fluently. His refusal to conform was not performative. It was bone deep, shaped by a lifetime of distrust toward power. Directors quickly learned that Brando would not follow instructions simply because they came from someone with a title. If he believed a scene needed something, he would change it on the spot. If he thought a line sounded artificial, he discarded it without hesitation. If he disliked the direction a film was heading, he confronted the producers with a bluntness that bordered on aggression. This wasn't arrogance. It was Brando's obsession with authenticity, an obsession that made him a genius on screen and a nightmare behind it. On the set of The Godfather, he ignored pages of dialogue, insisting that Don Corleone should speak softly, almost as if every word pained him. Studio executives panicked, wanting a loud, forceful mafia boss. Brando refused. He stuffed tissues into his cheeks to transform his face, lowered his voice into a haunted whisper, and moved with the weary dignity of a man who had seen death too many times. When the executives watched the footage, they were stunned. His instinct had been right again. But Hollywood never forgot how close they had come to losing control of him, and how little he cared about their approval. His legendary habit of refusing to memorize lines only amplified this tension. Rather than study scripts, he demanded that lines be written on cue cards, taped to walls, hidden inside props, or tucked behind co-stars. To the industry, this looked like laziness, but to Brando, it was the only way to keep performances raw and alive. He despised anything that felt rehearsed. He wanted the camera to capture emotion as it happened, not emotion repeated until it lost meaning. His methods were infuriating to directors, yet undeniably effective. The camera adored the electricity in his unpredictability. The peak of his rebellion came in 1973 when he won the Academy Award for The Godfather. Instead of attending the ceremony, he sent Sachin Littlefeather, a young Native American activist, to decline the award on his behalf and deliver a message condemning Hollywood's violent and discriminatory portrayal of indigenous people. The audience erupted in boos, jeers, and outrage. It was a public humiliation of the industry, a reminder that Brando refused to be celebrated by a system he believed was corrupt. Overnight, he became both a hero and an enemy, depending on who you asked. His refusal to play the game extended beyond awards and film sets. Contracts, public appearances, studio demands, none of it mattered to him. Hollywood executives described him as a man who didn't fear consequences because he had never believed in the system to begin with. And they were right. Brando did not want to belong to Hollywood. He wanted to expose its illusions. He didn't want power. He wanted integrity. But integrity, in an industry built on control, came at a price. And the price was isolation, a distance that grew wider with every battle he chose to fight. If Marlon Brando revolutionized acting on screen, then off-screen he created a myth of seduction and destruction that Hollywood still whispers about. His beauty, his charisma, the wildness in his eyes, all of it formed a gravitational pull too powerful for almost anyone to resist. Women fell for him with a kind of intensity that bordered on obsession, not because he was flawless, but because he radiated a wounded sensuality that made people believe they could save him, tame him, heal him, or at least understand him in ways the world never had. But loving Brando was never a romance. It was a collision, a storm, a dance with a man whose heart had learned to protect itself by breaking others first. His relationships with some of the most iconic women of the century, Marilyn Monroe, Rita Moreno, Ava Gardner, Sophia Loren, Gene Simmons, Ursula Andress, were not just tabloid stories, but reflections of the emotional chaos he carried inside. To the public, he looked like a god who had everything. To the women who knew him intimately, he was a man drowning quietly, terrified of abandonment, and trapped in the patterns carved into him during childhood. Every time he felt someone getting too close, he pulled away with a suddenness that felt cruel. Every time he feared rejection, he struck first. Every time he sensed love turning serious, he sabotaged the moment before it could hurt him. Rita Moreno understood this better than anyone. Their relationship, which lasted years, was a cycle of passion and heartbreak so intense that she later described him as the love of my life and the torment of my life. With Brando, she experienced the highest highs, the intoxicating charm, the vulnerability that flickered through his bravado, the rare moments when he let his guard fall, and the lowest lows when he disappeared without explanation, acted with indifference, or allowed his emotional storms to swallow everything in their path. He could be tender one moment and devastatingly distant the next, as if he were fighting invisible ghosts that always won. What made Brando so dangerously seductive was not merely his looks, but the contradiction between the man he showed the world and the man who lived inside him. On the surface, he was confidence, desire, raw masculinity. Beneath the surface, he was insecurity, fear, and a longing for affection he didn't know how to receive. This duality made him irresistible because everyone who loved him believed they could reach the wounded core he hid. But the closer they came, the further he slipped away. It wasn't manipulation, it was survival. Brando loved deeply, but he loved through the lens of trauma, through the expectation that everything beautiful eventually vanished, just as his mother had vanished from him night after night. Hollywood created a myth that Brando was a womanizer, someone who pursued pleasure without consequence, but the truth was more tragic. He wasn't chasing women, he was chasing a feeling he could never hold on to, the feeling of being safe, wanted, seen. The more he searched for it, the more destructive he became. His affairs weren't victories. They were symptoms of a man trying to fill a void that fame, beauty, and talent could never close. The tragedy of Marlon Brando's love life wasn't the chaos he caused. It was the heartbreak he experienced, even when the world believed he had everything. The man who conquered cinema could not conquer the fear of being left alone, a fear that grew louder with every failed relationship, every betrayal, and every moment when he looked into someone's eyes and saw a reflection of the boy he used to be, the boy who believed he was unlovable. And that fear would eventually grow into something even darker, something that would follow him into the next stage of his life, where love no longer hurt him from the outside, but from within his own bloodline. For all the storms Marlon Brando created in Hollywood, nothing compared to the storm that erupted inside his own family. It was the one battlefield he could never dominate, the one darkness he could never outsmart, and the one place where all the wounds of his childhood returned to crush him with a force the world never saw coming. If Brando's career was defined by rebellion, then his private life was defined by a curse, A chain of tragedies so deep and violent that even he believed it was the universe punishing him for the chaos he carried within. Everything began with Christian Brando, his son from his turbulent relationship with Anna Kashfi. Christian grew up surrounded by the same volatility that had shaped Brando's own childhood: parental conflict, emotional instability, and a father who loved deeply but inconsistently, drifting in and out of his children's lives as fame, pain, and overwhelming guilt pulled him in every direction. Christian admired his father, feared him, craved him, resented him, a combination that created a pressure so intense it needed somewhere to explode. That explosion came in 1990, when Christian shot and killed Dag Drolet, the boyfriend of his half-sister, Cheyenne. The case became an international spectacle, a public dissection of a family already collapsing under its emotional weight. Brando stood in court as his son faced the consequences, his voice trembling as he tried to protect him, his eyes filled with a despair he could barely contain. It wasn't just a legal tragedy. It was a mirror Brando had spent his entire life avoiding, a reflection of the violence, the instability, the generational pain that had never truly left him. And now it was playing out in front of cameras, in front of the world, in front of the ghosts he had tried to bury. But the curse didn't end with Christian. It went deeper, darker, and more devastating with Cheyenne Brando. Beautiful, fragile, and emotionally fractured, she carried the same raw sensitivity her father had, but without the tools to survive it. The trauma of her boyfriend's death destroyed her spirit, and years of depression pulled her further and further from the world until she could no longer find her way back. Her passing shattered what remained of Brando's emotional defenses. It wasn't just grief. It was the unbearable realization that the pain which had shaped him had now consumed his own child. People often talk about Hollywood tragedies as if they belong to the screen, but this was not a script, not a performance, and not a myth. It was the brutal reality of a man who had spent his entire life running from the wounds of his childhood, only to watch those same wounds pass down through his bloodline like an inheritance he never intended to give. Brando became haunted by the idea that he had failed as a father, that the chaos inside him had seeped into the lives of his children, that everything he tried to keep locked inside himself had escaped and destroyed the people he loved most. In interviews near the end of his life, he spoke cautiously, almost as if every word carried a weight he could barely lift. He didn't blame fate. He didn't blame Hollywood. He blamed himself, not because he had caused every tragedy, but because he believed he had never learned how to love in a way that didn't carry the echo of his own childhood pain. And as the years passed, as Christian struggled and Cheyenne vanished, Brando retreated deeper into isolation, convinced that the curse was real and that he was its unwilling anchor. It was this grief, not fame, not failure, not scandal, that ultimately hollowed him out. The world saw a legend fading. Brando saw a father who couldn't save the people he loved. And it was this truth, more than any other, that haunted him until the very last night of his life. In the final chapter of Marlon Brando's life, when the cameras had stopped calling and the world had moved on to newer faces and newer myths, he found himself confronting the one truth he had avoided for decades, that no matter how many characters he transformed into, no matter how many battles he fought against Hollywood, and no matter how fiercely he tried to bury his past, he could never fully escape the boy who had grown up afraid, abandoned, and aching for a love that always slipped through his fingers. The brilliance that made him a legend and the volatility that made him infamous were never separate forces. They were two sides of the same wound, two reflections of a lifetime spent trying to rewrite a story that had been carved into him long before the world ever knew his name. In the quiet darkness of his final years, surrounded not by applause but by silence, Brando understood what the world had never been able to see, that fame had amplified his pain instead of healing it, that genius had isolated him more than it had connected him, and that the tragedies of his children were not curses from the outside, but echoes of a generational hurt he had never learned to break. It was a realization that weighed heavier than any award he had won and deeper than any role he had mastered. And so he retreated, not as a fallen star, but as a man finally stripped of illusions, living in a home where the curtains stayed closed, where memories pressed against the walls, and where the truth he had carried for a lifetime finally caught up to him. Marlon Brando, the actor who reshaped cinema, died not as a myth, but as a human being, fragile, wounded, searching. And perhaps that is the real legacy he left behind. A reminder that even the brightest legends carry shadows the world never sees, and that sometimes the most unforgettable performances are the ones we give when no one is watching.